All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You've handed us, well, quite a fascinating stack of material today.
Yeah, it's all focused on one specific candidate, Bob Achgill, running for Bryan, Texas City Council.
That's right, Achgill. And just so we're all on the same page, the sources note it's pronounced Achgill.
Good to know. And yeah, it really is a deep stack, like you said. We've got campaign points, interviews, some really detailed policy stuff in here.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is basically to unpack all this material you shared. We want to pull out the key insights.
Help you get a clear picture of what these specific sources present about Bob Achgill.
Yeah, his background, his vision for Bryan, and the solutions he's putting forward.
And it's interesting because it's not just local stuff, is it? Some broader issues, too.
Definitely. We'll stick strictly to the information you've given us, of course.
Think of it as us mapping out this info landscape together, highlighting the main points from these documents. It's quite a range.
Okay, let's dive in then. Where should we start? Maybe his background before the city council run.
Sounds good. The sources paint a picture of a pretty diverse background.
It really is varied. Starts with engineering, right?
Mechanical engineering degree from Texas A&M. That was back in 1981, according to this.
And he used it. Worked at Amoco Chemicals for, what, 7 years?
7 years there, then 5 years with IBM FSD.
Ah, the Space Shuttle Program connection.
Right. The sources mention that, working on complex engineering problems. There's even a patent mention.
Chemical aerosol abatement. Sounds technical.
And his time at IBM, particularly after the Challenger disaster, involved failure analysis data, improving safety decisions. So a history of technical thinking, risk analysis.
That's a solid foundation. But then the sources show a pretty significant shift, don't they?
Yeah, a big one. This is where the international volunteer work comes in.
He and his family moved to Russia in 1993.
And this part's pretty striking. The sources say it was actually at the invitation of the Russian Minister of Education.
That definitely makes you pause. An official invitation.
Seems so. And they weren't alone. Part of a huge group, 5,000 American volunteers, the sources say.
5,000. Wow. Teaching Bible morals and ethics.
To public school teachers across all 11 time zones of Russia. That's the description.
That scale is incredible. And he was there for 12 years.
12 in Russia, yeah. But 18 years total living abroad. Places like Bulgaria, Estonia, Israel, Jordan, too.
So a lot of time outside the U.S.
And according to these documents, that experience, seeing needs in the developing world, that's what sparked this big project of his.
The literacy quest. Mother tongue literacy for all languages.
Exactly, for all 7,000 estimated languages. That led to the His Hands Reader project.
Tell us more about that. The sources describe it as free, crowdsourced.
Yeah, a free, crowdsourced curriculum development process. It's been a volunteer effort for, get this, 28 years.
28 years. That's dedication.
And a key part highlighted is the focus on deaf children, developing curriculum using local hand signs.
That seems really specific and important. There was a statistic tied to that.
There was. His research, as cited here, estimates potentially 50 million deaf people worldwide lack access to any language.
50 million, wow.
So the project aims to bridge that gap, give them a pathway to literacy. The website mentioned is hishandsreader.org.
Okay, so a global humanitarian focus born from living overseas. Then the sources bring him back to Bryan.
Right. He returned in 2012. The main reason cited was to care for his mother.
And the sources really emphasize his family's deep roots in Bryan. Multi-generational.
For multi-generational roots, yeah. Kids, grandkids in local schools, kids graduating from A&M. Deep ties.
And the sources frame this as giving him a unique perspective on Bryan's issues. Seeing them from cradle to grave, I think was the phrase used.
That's the idea presented. His motivation, as described here, seems to boil down to helping people.
Focusing on the least, the last, and the lost, as he puts it.
He connects his path, the literacy project, to his faith. And he expresses a need for sort of a shift in local government, more accountability.
Okay, that gives us a good sense of the background presented. Let's pivot now to the actual city council candidacy. District 3, election November 5th. 2024.
Right. He identifies several key challenges in Bryan and, well, some pretty distinct proposed solutions.
Housing affordability seems like a big one in these sources.
Definitely. He cites a figure 46% of Bryan's family housing is investor-owned.
And he calls that an investor-induced housing bubble. Says it drives up taxes, makes it hard for families to buy.
His solution, as laid out here, is pretty bold. He wants to pop the investor-induced housing bubble.
How? What's the mechanism?
By doubling house taxes on non-homestead properties, so investment properties, rentals,
Okay, double tax on those.
while at the same time doubling the homestead exemption, the tax break for owner-occupied homes.
So hit investors harder, give homeowners a bigger break. The goal being,
Discourage large investors, the quote is, kick Wall Street off of Home Street and bring prices back down to, well, normal levels.
very direct proposal there. What's next on his local agenda, according to the sources?
Traffic issues, specifically those medians on Texas Avenue.
Yes, the medians. What's his take?
He sees them as a problem for businesses, for emergency vehicles getting around, says it pushes traffic into neighborhoods.
Does he question how they got there?
Yeah, he asks why TXDOT put them in during the pandemic, seemingly without public approval, feels the council wasn't looking out for residents enough.
And his solution is just as direct as the housing one, isn't it? He references Reagan.
He does bulldoze the medians, makes a direct comparison to Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Wow. And he suggests money spent elsewhere could have paid for it.
Specifically mentions $30 million he claims was wasted on Midtown, suggesting that Hermé could have funded the median removal.
Okay, so that brings us neatly to another major theme. City spending, transparency, and this Midtown project.
Right. He expresses concern about what he terms runaway spending of windfall tax money. Questions transparency?
Points to potential savings.
Like looking into 20 new professional hires mentioned on the city website. He estimates that could be a $4 million saving. Also questions the dialogue, or lack thereof, between candidates and the city manager.
And he seems particularly critical of the city manager's spending authority regarding Midtown, that $130 million development.
Very critical. The sources quote him calling it a pay-for-play Disneyland.
Why Disneyland? What's the argument?
He argues the costs for activities there, like maybe $5 a day for basketball he mentions, are just unaffordable for, he claims, half the families in Bryan.
And it's on public parkland.
150 acres of it. He questions why ceding public park access for this didn't need, citizen input or a bond election.
You contrast that with other developments.
Yeah, he thanks groups like the Bombers baseball team for their investment in downtown, making it safer. The core issue seems to be using public resources for projects he feels aren't accessible or accountable to everyone.
Okay. There's also a very serious social issue he tackles: human trafficking.
Yes, the sources highlight this as a major concern for him. He cites a stark number: 400 people missing in the Brazos Valley in 2023.
400.
He breaks it down as one loved one every day, calls trafficking worse than murder because the victim is, in his words, dying every day.
And he links tackling this to the city's overall health.
Yeah, says a city's health is shown by how it cares for the weakest.
What's his proposed solution? It involves funding, right? A specific mechanism.
Very specific. He suggests taking 5% of the city's annual budget, which he states is $450 million, so that's $22.5 million.
Okay, 5%. For what?
To fund a $50,000 bounty for the capture and conviction of traffickers.
A bounty. And how would that be sustained?
He also proposes a $50,000 fine on convicted traffickers, specifically to cover the bounty costs, making it potentially a self-funding loop based on these sources.
So local platform. Housing taxes, medians, city spending oversight, and his trafficking bounty system. But as you said, the sources show his focus goes much wider.
Absolutely. This is where we get into state and even national issues, which is, well, pretty unusual for a city council race context. Spaceport royalties and water security are big ones here.
Let's unpack the spaceport royalties first. His view seems different from the usual yay space narrative.
It really does. He argues that space exploration today, especially things like satellite launches from Boca Chica down in Texas, isn't really about Mars science anymore.
What's it about then, in his view?
He claims it's fundamentally about securing a global internet monopoly. He throws out a figure, a $1.4 trillion per year industry.
$1 trillion. Wow. And he's critical of the Texas law related to this.
Very. He calls the 2012 Texas space tourism law the biggest bank robbery in history.
Strong words. Why?
He alleges it lets billionaires profit massively and ravage parklands near places like Boca Chica without fair compensation to the public.
And safety concerns, too.
Big time. Highlights SpaceX launching just 6 miles from South Padre Island. Argues safety requires a much bigger radius, maybe 50 miles. Questions the FAA's failure analysis process, too.
Have the sources mentioned him trying to raise these issues before?
Yes, they mention personal advocacy, pleading with Texas Parks and Wildlife, doing a KBTX interview, submitting comments to the FAA on launches even at Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
So his concern isn't just Texas.
Seems broader. He also notes, interestingly, that France has apparently declared Starlink a monopoly, framing it as evidence for his global monopoly point.
Okay, so if he sees huge profits being made, what's his proposed solution for Texans regarding these royalties?
It's quite something. He argues Texas residents should get 90% of Texas spaceport royalties.
90%? How would that even work?
Through a personal trust fund system for every resident, he points to Norway's oil fund as a model for managing resource wealth for citizens.
And based on his $1.4 trillion industry estimate, what does he think that 90% could mean per person?
His calculation, as presented here, suggests it could be around $2,000 per month per Texan.
2,000 a month. That's a staggering figure from these sources.
Yeah.
And he links this state idea to a national problem.
Correct. He connects it directly to Social Security solvency. Argues that collecting Social Security tax on that kind of distributed income could make the system solvent again.
And he wants action on this now.
Yeah, calls for Governor Abbott to hold a special legislative session before the November election to change that 2012 law.
Any mention of involving national figures.
Yes, appeals to Donald Trump are mentioned, framing it as a way to win Texas votes by helping seniors on Social Security and maybe suggesting Elon Musk's donation be returned.
Okay, wow. So that's a city council candidate proposing state royalty trusts impacting national entitlements. Definitely broad scope. What about the other big state issue, water security?
Right, another critical Texas resource. His engineering background seems relevant here. He points out vulnerabilities.
Like San Antonio's reliance on Bryan's aquifer.
Exactly. Says SA gets 20% of its water from Bryan's Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer, while SA's own Edwards aquifer is way down, like 30% capacity. Also mentions DFW looking for new water due to carcinogen issues.
So what's his fix for Texas water?
Two main parts. First, he thinks the legislature should tax water that gets piped out of its home aquifer region.
Taxing water transport. To what end?
To fund desalination projects, turning Gulf water into fresh water on a massive scale.
Desalination. Does he get specific on the how?
He does. He advocates using Israeli desalination tech, presents it as highly efficient, and proposes a huge infrastructure project.
Which is?
A massive pipeline, 21 feet in diameter, running from the Gulf, maybe Galveston Bay, north along I-45 or the Trinity River, all the way to Dallas.
A 21-foot pipeline. That sounds enormous. Cost.
He provides an estimate in the sources. Claims it would cost about 33 cents per person per day, breaks it down to $1.30 for the desalination itself, and 0.03 cents for the pipeline, paid off over 30 years.
And the capacity.
He claims it could supply enough water for 7 San Antonios, a long-term solution for a huge part of Texas, as he sees it.
So, looking at all this material, you really get a sense of a candidate connecting the dots, or at least trying to, between very local Bryan issues, taxes, traffic, and these huge state, national, even global topics like space and water.
It definitely reflects that perspective the sources mention, gained from living abroad, coming back with maybe a different appreciation, but also a critical eye for bigger systems.
There's a quote summarizing his goal.
Yeah. Bryan will become an oasis for clean water. Unnecessary walls will come down. We will lead the way in challenging oligarchs who seek to monopolize our space rights, votes, and homes. Pretty ambitious.
And he lists specific outcomes he hopes for within a year. A 5-point plan idea.
The sources mention things like affordable house prices, lower taxes, finding missing loved ones, families choosing Bryan for safety, Bryan as a water oasis, walls coming down and challenging these oligarchs.
And he emphasizes public accountability to get there.
Definitely. Stresses it requires a change in mindset and the public holding leaders accountable.
Well, this deep dive has certainly surfaced a lot of very specific information from the sources you gave us on Bob Achgill. Quite a platform.
It really paints a picture of a candidate trying to weave together local concerns with these much larger state and national policy proposals, all driven by his background and stated motivations.
It shows how interconnected he believes these levels are.
Absolutely.
Hopefully this walkthrough gives you, our listener, that quick understanding of what's in these particular sources about this candidate. We've tried to pull out the specifics for you.
Yeah, covered the background, the local platform points for Bryan, housing, traffic, spending, trafficking, and then those bigger ideas on space royalties and water security, all straight from the documents provided.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, something to chew on after hearing all this from the sources. When you see a local candidate campaigning on such a wide spectrum, from city medians all the way to space policy and state water infrastructure, how does that make you think about the lines between local, state, and national governance? Do those lines blur, or should they?
It definitely challenges the traditional boxes we put these things in, doesn't it? Something to consider.